December 9th, 2001. It was just after 2:40 a.m. when the 911 call came in from an upscale mansion nestled in Forest Hills, a wealthy suburb of Durham, North Carolina. The man on the line sounded frantic. "My wife had an accident. She's still breathing. Please hurry. She fell down the stairs. She's not conscious." The caller was Michael Peterson, a novelist and former local politician. He and his wife, Kathleen Peterson, were considered the ideal power couple. He was witty, charming, and intellectual. She was a successful executive at Nortel Networks and the financial backbone of their household. To outsiders, their life seemed perfect. A sprawling home filled with laughter, 5 children between them from previous relationships, and a social life peppered with fundraisers, holiday parties, and dinner events. But that illusion shattered within moments. When paramedics arrived, they found Kathleen lying in a pool of blood at the bottom of a narrow staircase. She was still breathing barely. Her body was badly injured, her scalp covered in deep lacerations. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, up the stairs. Kathleen was pronounced dead shortly after. Michael told police that Kathleen had been drinking wine and possibly taking Valium. He said she must have lost her balance and fallen. He claimed he had been outside by the pool when the accident happened. But to the first responders, something didn't sit right. The scene that didn't add up. Falls happen. But this? The sheer amount of blood at the scene looked more like the aftermath of a violent assault than a domestic mishap. Blood spatters reached several feet up the wall. There were streaks indicating movement, dragging, maybe. Kathleen's head wounds were consistent with repeated blows rather than a single impact from falling. Investigators questioned how Michael hadn't heard the fall, or her cries, if any. How could someone suffer that level of trauma simply tumbling down a dozen steps? Worse yet, the position of Kathleen's body looked staged. She was lying almost too neatly at the base of the stairs, her legs tucked unnaturally behind her. Forensic teams began photographing and documenting everything. One thing was becoming clear. This wasn't an open and shut case. A marriage under a microscope. As detectives started probing deeper, the facade of the Petersons' seemingly idyllic marriage began to crack. They were known to argue about finances. Kathleen was under stress from looming layoffs at Nortel. And Michael? He had secrets, some he'd kept well hidden. Detectives confiscated both of their computers and phones. They began interviewing friends, family, and co-workers. Was Kathleen depressed? Had there been domestic violence? The answers varied. Friends of Kathleen insisted she would never fall or kill herself. She was too sharp, too balanced. Others noted she was tired and overwhelmed lately. Meanwhile, Michael was cooperating almost too calmly. His behavior raised eyebrows. At the police station, he appeared collected, almost detached. Some wondered, was this just a man in shock? Or someone who had rehearsed his story? Forensics tell a different story. As the autopsy report came in, suspicions escalated. Kathleen had 7 deep lacerations on her scalp, but no skull fractures. The medical examiner determined her injuries weren't consistent with a fall down the stairs. Instead, they appeared to be inflicted by a blunt object. The official cause of death? Homicide. That changed everything. Michael Peterson was no longer a grieving husband. He was now the primary suspect. The media storm begins. News of the case spread like wildfire. The community was stunned. A well-known, well-liked couple. A brutal death in a wealthy neighborhood. And a husband who claimed innocence. It had all the makings of a true crime sensation. As reporters began digging into Michael's past, the story would only grow more bizarre. And before long, a second staircase death would emerge from his history, raising questions that no one expected. The news that Kathleen Peterson's death was ruled a homicide sent shockwaves through Durham and beyond. It wasn't just that a woman had died under suspicious circumstances. It was that her charming, eloquent, seemingly devoted husband was now under suspicion of cold-blooded murder. And the deeper investigators looked, the more cracks they found in Michael Peterson's carefully curated image. Secrets behind the smile. Michael had built his reputation on intellect and charisma. He was a local celebrity of sorts, a novelist who once ran for mayor. His published books, mostly military thrillers, painted him as a patriot, a family man, a loving husband. But detectives found contradictions everywhere. First came the discovery of explicit emails on Michael's computer. Emails exchanged with young men, some of whom were sex workers. These messages made it clear Michael was bisexual, and Kathleen apparently had no idea. Investigators found photos, chat logs, and financial transactions tied to escort services. One man, in particular, told police that Michael had arranged to meet him while Kathleen was out of town. This revelation turned the case on its head. Was Kathleen confronting Michael about his secret life that night? Had an argument escalated into murder? Was her death not an accident, but a confrontation gone horribly wrong? The blow-poke mystery. Prosecutors theorized that Kathleen was beaten to death with a fireplace blow-poke, a long, thin, hollow rod used to stir embers. The family had received one as a gift years earlier, but now it was missing from the house. This supposed murder weapon became central to the case. It fit the dimensions of the lacerations on Kathleen's head and could deliver enough force to cause internal bleeding without fracturing the skull. It was light enough to leave bruises but not shatter bone, consistent with her injuries. Michael insisted he had no idea where the blowpoke was. That didn't help his case. The other staircase death. Then came the twist that made headlines nationwide. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they discovered a case from 1985, a death eerily similar to Kathleen's. Michael had lived in Germany with his first wife during his time working with the Department of Defense. They had close friends, George and Elizabeth Ratliff. When Elizabeth died, it was Michael who found her, dead at the bottom of her staircase with head trauma and blood on the walls. He told German authorities it was an accident. At the time, it was ruled a cerebral hemorrhage. But now, Durham prosecutors were calling it a blueprint. Even more chilling, after Elizabeth's death, Michael adopted her two daughters, Margaret and Martha, raising them as his own. They lived with Michael and Kathleen in Durham and still stood by him. But the coincidence was too much for investigators to ignore. The body of Elizabeth Ratliff was exhumed. Forensic analysts found injuries disturbingly similar to Kathleen's. Suddenly, what looked like one tragic fall began to look like a pattern. The public turns. The media frenzy around the case intensified. Tabloid headlines painted Michael as a closeted killer who murdered his wife to keep his secrets. The bisexuality angle became a spectacle, even though prosecutors maintained they didn't care about orientation, only about motive. Social media exploded. Half the country believed Michael was a killer hiding behind literary fame and a calm demeanor. The other half believed this was a witch hunt, a bisexual man being tried in the court of public opinion. The Peterson home, once admired for its architectural beauty, became a crime scene swarmed by news vans and conspiracy theorists. Still, Michael maintained his innocence. He said Kathleen knew about his bisexuality and accepted him. He denied any argument that night, denied any confrontation, and most of all, denied murder. The question looming over the case wasn't just, did she fall? It was, who was Michael Peterson, really? A case built on shadows. There was no clear murder weapon, no confession, no surveillance footage, just blood, suspicion, and two women dead at the bottom of two different staircases, 16 years and an ocean apart, with one man as the common denominator. The prosecution's case rested on circumstantial evidence, but it was damning. The blood spatter, the missing blowpoke, the secret emails, the second staircase death, and a growing list of inconsistencies in Michael's version of events. Still, the defense would argue that Kathleen had simply fallen while intoxicated. They would question the autopsy findings. They would challenge the reliability of forensic experts. And as jury selection began, Durham prepared for one of the most sensational trials in North Carolina history. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. The courthouse in Durham, North Carolina, was buzzing. After months of whispers, news reports, and televised speculation, the People versus Michael Peterson officially began. The man who once charmed social circles now stood accused of murdering his wife in cold blood. He faced a life sentence without parole if found guilty. But if there was one thing this trial would prove, it was that nothing about this case would be simple. Opening salvos, a tale of two stories. The prosecution and defense painted two entirely different pictures. Prosecutor Jim Hardin opened with force. He described Kathleen's death not as a tragic fall, but as a violent act, an intentional, sustained assault, fueled by betrayal, secrets, and rage. He called it premeditated. He pointed to the blood, the injuries, the missing blow poke, and of course, Michael's double life. He had motive, he had opportunity, and he had done it before. Hardin told the jury, referencing the death of Elizabeth Ratliff in Germany. But the defense team, led by David Rudolph, countered with sharp precision. They said the state's case was built on prejudice and assumptions. That Michael and Kathleen had a happy marriage. That Kathleen knew about his sexuality. That her injuries were entirely consistent with a fall down the stairs, especially if she'd been drinking wine and taking Valium. There's no murder weapon, Rudolph reminded the jury. There are no witnesses, no confession, no evidence that he pushed her, hit her, or even argued with her. And the mystery deepened. The blood evidence, science or speculation. The most disturbing images of the entire trial came from the bloodstained staircase. Forensic analyst Dwayne Deaver, from North Carolina's State Bureau of Investigation, took the stand. He showed jurors high-resolution photos of spatter patterns, blood droplets, and smears along the wall and floor. He claimed the patterns were consistent with blunt force trauma, not a simple fall. Deaver conducted experiments using sponges, mannequins, and staged attacks. In court, he testified that the blood told a story. Kathleen had been struck multiple times and tried to crawl away, but Rudolph attacked Deaver's credibility. He exposed flaws in Deaver's methods, inconsistencies in his notes, and revealed the analyst had no formal training in blood spatter analysis. Years later, Deaver's work would lead to massive fallout, but in that courtroom, the damage was done. The blow poke returns. Midway through the trial, the defense made a shocking announcement. They had found the missing blow poke in the garage of the Peterson home, covered in cobwebs and dust, completely intact, with no traces of blood or damage. It was a major blow to the prosecution's theory. If the alleged weapon showed no signs of being used, did that weaken the case? Or was it too convenient, too perfectly timed? The prosecution argued it was a decoy. The defense called it exoneration. Either way, the jury was left confused and conflicted. The Ratliff connection. History repeating? Another dramatic moment came when the court heard from German investigators. Prosecutors argued that the death of Elizabeth Ratliff wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. Her exhumed body revealed injuries they said mirrored Kathleen's. And who had been the last person to see her alive? Michael Peterson. But the defense struck back. They brought in Margaret and Martha Ratliff, the daughters Michael adopted. Both testified in his defense, saying he had never been violent, that he was a loving father, that Elizabeth's death had haunted him for years. It raised an unsettling question for the jury. Could someone who appeared so loving also be a killer? Kathleen's last moments. Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from Kathleen's co-workers and family. They described her as vibrant, brilliant, and ambitious. A rising executive at Nortel Networks who was stressed but excited about an upcoming promotion. She had been the family's primary breadwinner. A forensic pathologist testified that Kathleen's injuries were not consistent with a fall. She had 7 deep lacerations on her scalp with no fractures, something that didn't match any typical stairway accident. But Rudolph brought in his own expert who argued that falls can be fatal, especially under the influence of alcohol and medication. Once again, jurors were caught between science and doubt, emotion and evidence, storytelling and truth. Michael on the stand. Against the advice of some, Michael Peterson took the stand. He spoke of his love for Kathleen. He admitted to his bisexuality but insisted Kathleen knew. He broke down describing the moment he found her, saying he saw blood everywhere and was paralyzed by panic. He denied killing her emphatically. Was he sincere, or was it a performance? That was the question every juror had to wrestle with. The verdict looms. As the trial came to a close, the tension was unbearable. The defense argued that the state had no proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution said the pattern was too perfect to ignore. 2 women, same injuries, same man, same staircase. After 3 months of testimony, it all came down to 12 strangers. When the verdict finally arrived, the entire nation held its breath. After months of explosive testimony, swirling speculation, and public obsession, the case of Kathleen Peterson's death reached a crescendo. But what came next would deepen the mystery and ignite even more debate. The trial ends, but questions multiply. In October 2003, the jury delivered its verdict. Michael Peterson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was stunned. Michael remained expressionless, while Kathleen's family members wept quietly. The defense team looked devastated. Despite presenting a compelling alternative to the prosecution's theory, it wasn't enough. To many, the state had successfully painted Michael as a cold, calculating killer who staged a fall to cover up a brutal beating. Yet others found the case disturbingly thin, fueled more by character assassination than solid forensic proof. But just when the case seemed settled, a bizarre theory emerged, and it wasn't from a lawyer. It came from a neighbor. The owl theory. Too crazy to be true? Enter Larry Pollard, a neighbor of the Petersons and a former lawyer. He suggested a stunning alternative. An owl was responsible for Kathleen's death. According to the owl theory, Kathleen had stepped outside that evening, perhaps to check holiday decorations or retrieve something from the yard. There, a barred owl, a species known to live in the area and capable of aggressive behavior, allegedly attacked her. The bird's talons could have caused the mysterious lacerations on her scalp. Disoriented, bleeding, and in pain, she may have staggered back inside, collapsed on the staircase, and bled to death. Ridiculous? At first glance, yes. But when experts examined the lacerations on her head, they noted their shape was oddly consistent with owl talons. Even more compelling, a microscopic feather and a sliver of wood from a tree were found clutched in Kathleen's hand and had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as a wild theory started to gain traction. A flawed prosecution. In the years after Michael's conviction, his team uncovered significant issues with the state's case. Chief among them was the conduct of Dwayne Deaver, the bloodstain analyst whose testimony had heavily influenced the jury. Deaver had a history of overstating evidence, and in 2011, he was fired for misconduct. It turned out that he had exaggerated his credentials and withheld exculpatory findings in past cases. This bombshell revelation led to Michael's conviction being overturned in 2011, and in 2017, as part of a plea deal, he entered an Alford plea, acknowledging the evidence could lead to a conviction while maintaining his innocence. He was sentenced to time already served and walked free. Free but never cleared. Today, Michael lives a quiet, relatively anonymous life. But the mystery of Kathleen's death has never been fully resolved. Was it a tragic accident? A spontaneous act of violence? Or something stranger like an owl attack? For every person convinced of Michael's guilt, there's another who believes he was the victim of a flawed system, railroaded by prosecutors eager for a conviction. The Peterson case became a media storm not just because of its grisly details, but because it peeled back layers of marriage, perception, justice, and truth. The lasting legacy. Kathleen Peterson's death wasn't just a tragedy. It became a symbol of how truth can be twisted, how justice isn't always clear, and how even the most shocking stories may still hold secrets. From the beginning, this case had everything: wealth, infidelity, mystery, blood, and betrayal. But what it never had, despite all the cameras, books, and documentaries, was closure. Because in the end, whether he said she fell, or whether she never had the chance to speak at all, only 2 people know what truly happened that night. And one of them is gone forever. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell.